after microbial biosensors, the next topic which we are going to learn is on nutrient cycling or biogeochemical cycles. All right. So let me tell you what that is all about. Now, essentially, all the different kind of elements that you see in the environment, like carbon, nitrogen, iron, or sulfur, phosphorus, etc., all of these are incorporated into biological materials. All right, take carbon for example, and carbon is present everywhere. I will tell you what are the sources where all it is present, what kind of reservoirs are there for carbon. But eventually, all of these elements are also recycled in the environment. Okay, so that is what makes the topic of biogeochemical cycles. So we are looking at the cycling of these elements like carbon, nitrogen, through inorganic forms, through atmosphere, into biological systems, and eventually getting it back into the atmosphere. Okay, so all of these elements, they need to be cycled. Take, for example, the carbon dioxide, which is entrapped in the form of CO2. Now, what we have found over the years, that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the environment has risen from 315 ppm, which was a number which was measured in 1958. Currently, the CO2 concentration, which is an indicator of how much carbon is present in the environment, okay, because carbon doesn't appear freely, but rather it appears as carbon dioxide. The concentration which was measured in 2013 is more than 400 ppm. Okay, so the amount of carbon which is present in the form of CO2 has considerably increased over the last, let's say, 60 years or something. In this picture is shown how carbon is cycled, for example, between different forms. In the atmosphere, you see that carbon is present in the form of carbon dioxide, which is then through photosynthesis, it is entrapped by either plants or by microbes, which are photosynthetic microorganisms, which are in the water bodies. And eventually this carbon is now entrapped in the form of this biomass. Okay, so you see it is now organic carbon. Here the carbon is in the inorganic form. Here the carbon is now in the organic form. That is, when plants are going to take carbon dioxide, they will fix it into carbohydrates, so on and so forth. So it is now organic carbon right here. Okay, so it is trapped. However, because of the plant matter and everything, the leaves are going to drop, the roots are going to die. Then there are decaying organisms which are going to feed on the plant matter. So if you had a carbohydrate or if you had lipid, for example, which is going to be completely converted into carbon dioxide and water. So this way, the carbon which was trapped in the form of organic carbon is going to be released again as carbon dioxide, okay, into the environment. And at the same time, not only do the decaying organisms play an important role in carbon cycling, but then we have animals which are going to, for example, they will feed on the food which is produced, or they could feed on the non-living things like goat or whatever. And they take all of that material, but then they respire. Okay, by respiration, what we mean is that they take up this organic matter from outside as food material. Through their biochemical pathways, they break it down into carbon dioxide and water, and that is how the carbon dioxide returns back to the atmosphere. Okay, so I hope these steps are clear to everybody, that how carbon which is in the environment means particularly in the atmosphere. Carbon is also present in the land. It's also present in the water bodies in the form of fossil fuels and other things, which is a trapped carbon source. So is this slide clear to everybody? Just to illustrate the concept of carbon cycle. So is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so now even the plants, they are also going to respire, for example, and they will release this carbon dioxide back into the environment. Or you could have, for example, through factory and vehicle emissions, whether we take petrol, which is also like a fossil fuel. This is an underground resource of carbon, or in factories, you can burn coal, for example, and then also carbon dioxide is released. So this carbon dioxide is emitted. So in other words, now you can see how the carbon rotates between different forms in the atmosphere, on the land, and in the oceanic water bodies. Now, how does this really happen? This is what we call as a carbon cycle. In a similar manner, the other elements like nitrogen, for example, iron, sulfur, phosphorus, all of these, they also undergo a very delicate balance in life where these are constantly cycled between different forms. So this is summarized here, that a delicate balance between the organic carbon, like you see in the plant matter, inorganic carbon, like in the form of carbon dioxide, is maintained, and it is largely through microbial activity. Okay, so this balance, in other words, yeah, does somebody have a question? If not, then we move forward. So plants are of course important, but they don't contribute as much as the microbes do to recycling of this carbon. Now, the second point which is important here is that the human use of stored organic carbon, either the fossil fuels and peat, etc., like you saw here, for example, that because of this excessive burning of fossil fuels, coal, etc., the level of carbon dioxide has increased from 315 ppm to 400 ppm in the atmosphere. Okay, now CO2 also happens to be responsible for global warming. Okay, and that's the reason we say that because of this increase in the carbon dioxide, it's a greenhouse gas. Okay, and it leads to increase in the environmental temperature. So we say because of this, there is global warming, and at the same time, there is also warming of permafrost. What does permafrost mean? It means, now the picture which is on the right will show you what is a permafrost. Now, generally, this is just below the soil layer, okay, the rocky area which you have here, except that in the polar regions, okay, this is nothing but ice. So all this landmass which you see here also has entrapped ice in it, which is called as a permafrost, which has a low ice content. Due to global warming, gradually, okay, this melts, the permafrost also warms up. There is a lot of CO2 which is entrapped in there that is also released into the environment. Okay, so that is the reason why the second point is written, that the human use of stored organic carbon such as fossil fuel and coal, etc., and the warming of this permafrost, they have upset this balance in favor of the release of carbon dioxide. And as a result of all of these factors, more and more carbon dioxide is released into the environment. This has had an impact on global warming. So there is an impact on the carbon cycle. Okay, so we understand that just the way we are disturbing the carbon because of man-made activities, the nitrogen cycle or the sulfur cycle, because when you burn the fossil fuels, there is sulfur which is present in these fossil fuels, which gets released in the form of sulfur dioxide, which are called as the oxides of sulfur, oxides of nitrogen, etc. As a result of which, these delicate nitrogen and sulfur balances in the air are also getting disturbed. And that is a bad effect overall on the ecosystem on Earth. So I hope this point is clear to everybody. Um, so now, here is the typical composition of an E. coli cell. It is only to illustrate that, when you try to look at, for example, what elements are predominantly present in an E. coli cell, which are pretty much reflective of what happens in other life forms also. So you see carbon makes up 50% of the dry mass, oxygen makes up 20%, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. All of these are called as the major elements. Okay. In addition to that, there are minor elements like potassium, calcium, magnesium, chlorine, iron, etc. Trace elements, and all of these are present in the cells. All right. And it has so therefore, what is entrapped, all these elements which are entrapped, eventually through microbial activity, all of these elements are returned back to the environment, then they are taken back into the cells, into the biomass. So this kind of a constant recycling occurs. Okay, why is it important for us to know that? Because understanding these cycles allows the scientists to understand and predict the development of microbial communities and activities in the environment. Okay, now remember, when you talk about something like wastewater, which contains a lot of organic matter, nitrogen, things like that, there are a lot of these microbial communities which will come together in order to recycle the carbon, in order to recycle the nitrogen which is present in the organic matter. Okay, so it allows you to understand how these different cycles are operating, what kind of microbial activities are operating in these microbial communities, what kind of biochemistry is happening in order for these cycles to be retained, to be functional. And many of these activities can be harnessed in a beneficial way. All right. So having a knowledge of how these are cycled, etc., will also allow you to apply this knowledge for remediation of organic and metal pollutants. Like, for example, there is organic matter like, these could be oil spills or whatever, which many of the microbial communities are able to degrade. So what if you want to develop a biotechnology based method for removal of these organic pollutants? Then you will know which microorganisms you should be picking up. You should be making up a microbial consortium, because you know what kind of biochemistries are operating in these cycles, in order to develop a technological solution for removing these organic pollutants or even metals. For example, many microbes, they recover precious metals from low grade ores like uranium. So you can use these methods, or you can use these biochemistries to your advantage. Okay, so is this point clear to everybody? I think students have to be more participative and more listening.
Yes,
So
ma'am, the point are very clear.
okay. All right. Because, I don't know. I'm sorry, you're sitting at home, you can be easily distracted. But then, you have to maintain a continuity. Just be in front of the computer and just listen to the lecture. Okay. So now, whatever points we have said, before we start to very quickly analyze these cycles, so here is a summary of what I have said so far. The cycling of carbon is extremely important, as excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to greenhouse effect. That means if the carbon, when you say recycling, that means there is just adequate amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, adequate amount which is trapped in the biomass or in the oceanic water bodies. Anytime when you disturb this balance, okay, then excess of carbon dioxide, for example, will lead to greenhouse effect. If there is anaerobic degradation of organic matter, that is, particularly when many of these organic matters are filled into the landfills. Okay, so many of the organic matter, things like that, are put into the landfill. But gradually, what will happen there is methane is going to be released, because through anaerobic microbial processes, this organic matter which is on the landmass, okay, doesn't get completely oxidized to carbon dioxide and water. But in the landfill, there's not enough oxygen under the earth. So you only have methane formation. Methane is also a greenhouse gas. That is, it leads to global warming. So such kind of activities can happen. Similarly, if there is also cycling of nitrogen, which happens, there is a very delicate balance of nitrogen in the atmosphere between the non-living, that is the nitrogen gas, and the living, in which the nitrogen is trapped as amino acids, as proteins, and microbes play a very important role in the cycling. Okay, if there is disturbance in the nitrogen cycle, how can that happen? When there is excessive use of nitrogen fertilizers, there is too much of nitrogen which is sitting in the environment. Okay, that can also lead to imbalance of the nitrogen cycle, and this can lead to what we called earlier as eutrophication. Excess fertilizers which are released into the water bodies will lead to algal blooms. And I had already discussed this topic earlier with you, that how algal blooms are very, very bad for economy and for the aquatic water system. Okay, it is nothing but putting too much of nitrogen in the environment, disturbing the nitrogen balance, which leads to that kind of a process. Now, when the nitrogen is recycled, for example, what has been found that there are various pathways which are operating, pathways which are called as denitrification. What do you mean by denitrification? That means when the nitrates, we will see how the nitrates which are released from on the death of microorganisms, or when the plant matter dies, for example, then nitrates are produced and these are returned back as atmospheric nitrogen. That process is called as denitrification. That is when you convert nitrates into nitrogen gas. That process is denitrification. And there are many microbes which are capable of doing that. And similarly, other gaseous forms of nitrogen, that is nitrate, could be converted into N2O or nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, and finally to nitrogen. So all of these are processes of denitrification. And these are extremely important when we talk about wastewater treatment. Because much of the organic matter which is released from the domestic waste contains proteins which get hydrolyzed into amino acids. And ammonium is formed. This ammonium is also converted first into nitrate by microorganisms, which is a process called as nitrification. Okay, so the domestic waste, what we have in the in these processes, it is first converted into ammonia and then into nitrate. So nitrification will occur and then denitrification will occur, as a result of which this nitrogen, which is in the form of ammonia, is converted into atmospheric nitrogen. And that is how we complete the nitrogen cycle. So a lot of microorganisms, a lot of microbial activity goes on in order to have this nitrogen cycle running in the atmosphere. Similarly, in sulfur cycling, there is dissimilatory reduction to sulfate, to H2S, and there is also assimilatory reduction. And this is a point which I will emphasize when I take up the sulfur cycle. Okay, now it is impossible for us to cover all the cycles, but then the carbon, the nitrogen, and the sulfur cycle is something which I will cover with you in order to make this point as to how these nutrient cycling is extremely important in the environment, what can we learn, and how new technologies can be derived based on our knowledge of these activities. So understanding of the microbial involvement in the cycling of these nutrients like carbon, sulfur, nitrogen is important, as we can either prevent them from happening, like excess of things can be prevented, or you can make them happen in a controlled manner to develop technologies, which is, good for the environment. So I hope this point is clear to everybody.
Yes, ma'am. It
Okay.
was clear.
All right. So now, before we start to look at individual cycles, there is something in ecology which was proposed by Gaia, and it is called as Gaia hypothesis. Now, what he proposed when he, over the years, he studied a lot of ecosystems and other things. And what he proposed is that the living organisms and their material environment are tightly coupled. And this coupled system is a superorganism. That is because these, whether it is plants or whether it is the microbes, they are an integral part of the environment, and together they constitute what is called as a superorganism. And as the superorganism evolves, there emerges a new property within that is called as the ability to self-regulate the climate as well as the chemistry of that environment. Okay, so Earth alone would not be able to regulate its chemistry. But then now that microbial activity happens, or any kind of a life activity, plants, animals, whatever, because of this activity, there is a superorganism which has the ability to self-regulate itself. This self-regulation could be in terms of the chemistry, in terms of the temperature, in terms of the various gases which are present, so on and so forth. In order to illustrate that point, now, here is the gaseous composition of different planets. That is, these are the planets which are very close to Earth in our solar system, like Venus or Mars, Earth without life and Earth with life. Okay, so let us see, because of the presence of life, how Earth is a superorganism and what kind of self-control does it exert. So if we look at the gaseous, composition, you see that the carbon dioxide is 96.5%, nitrogen 3.5%, Oxygen, only traces of oxygen are present on Venus. Argon, 70 ppm, methane, surface temperature 459 degrees centigrade. Okay, if we look at the temperature of Mars, for example, uh, temperature as well as, Mars is farther away from Earth. So the temperature there is minus 53. And if you look at the gases, carbon dioxide 95%, so on and so forth. Now, if on Earth we did not have any life, then based on the distance from the sun, this is what we could have predicted, that the temperature of the that carbon dioxide should have been 98%, nitrogen 1.9%, oxygen should have been 0, argon 0.1, no methane, and surface temperature should have been 290 degrees. Okay. However, what is the temperature of Earth? Because of the life forms, it is only 13 degrees average temperature. And look at the composition of the gases. Carbon dioxide only 0.03%, nitrogen 9%, oxygen on the other hand 21%, so on and so forth. Okay, so therefore, in other words, it is true that because of recycling of, or because of the microbial activity, Earth per se does not really behave in isolation, but along with the microbial activity, it is now a totally different type of a system which has the capability to regulate its chemistry strongly, as shown by the different gases, or it's able to regulate its temperature to only 13 degrees, the Earth temperature. Okay, that is why, this became all the more important, that the microbial activity, recycling of nutrients, etc., has a major role to play in terms of what Earth is today. And that's what makes it habitable. And so what has been the role of biogeochemical cycles in this? So early on, the atmosphere on the Earth, I think if you just look at this leftmost, this thing, early on, the environment in the Earth was highly anaerobic because there was no molecular oxygen at that time. There were only abiotic processes happening, such as, like, because of solar radiation coming in, because of UV, etc. It drove the formation of organic matter. Okay, because remember that this experiment was also, in biochemistry, you must have read that this experiment was carried out by Miller also in a glass vessel, where carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen was put together, and it was subjected to high voltage, and then certain organic polymers were actually formed during this. So that is why it is proposed that even when life was not there, because of abiotic processes such as UV radiation, etc., the nitrates in the earth, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the water, they could all come together to make the organic matter. Okay, and this organic matter initially was used by anaerobic heterotrophs. As the earth evolved, for example, the microbes arrived which started to fix the atmospheric carbon dioxide, like, these are photosynthetic microorganisms. And initially these were all anaerobic, because remember that in the process of photosynthesis, there are a lot of bacteria which carry out photosynthesis in the absence of oxygen. Okay, I'm sure you have read it somewhere, because the idea is that oxygen is used as the terminal electron acceptor for fixation of hydrogen. Okay, but they can use sulfur, they can use nitrates, etc., to pick up, so these are all anaerobic photosynthesizing bacteria. They don't need molecular oxygen. And then cyanobacteria came, and as a result of this photosynthetic activity, or fixing the atmospheric carbon dioxide, okay, production, because when the cyanobacteria came, okay, then molecular oxygen was formed as a byproduct of photosynthesis. So oxygen became available, which happened about 2 billion years ago. There was a change in the Earth's atmosphere from anaerobic to aerobic. Ozone layer formed, and this allowed the higher forms of life to be developed, because then the ozone will also give protection against the dangerous UV rays, etc. That allowed other life forms to develop. As the carbon cycle developed, the nitrogen cycle also developed. Okay, so in other words, the idea of showing you all this is that all of these activities, going from an early anaerobic atmosphere to anaerobic bacteria photosynthesizing, and eventually to production of oxygen, has taken billions of years, all of these activities have been unidirectional. Evolution of life forms to deal with these situations have taken billions of years. So now you cannot disturb these cycles and expect to find a solution overnight. So if you disturb the CO2 cycle or something like that, it's going to take billions of years. So the only way to avoid that is, if the life forms don't have to perish, is to find a solution so that these cycles are kept in a balance. Because otherwise the time that it takes for them to naturally come to a balance are very, very long. It takes, as it says, it takes billions of years. Okay, so I hope this point is clear to everybody.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
and the percentage mentioned on the slide, where it was mentioned that Earth with life and Earth without life, what
Yes.
the percentage is reflecting? Like, is it like out of the total gases present, nitrogen is 9%? Was it like that?
Uh, Nitrogen is 9, or yeah, oxygen is 21. And because, of course, when we see, for example, Earth's atmosphere right here, okay, so I can't recall right now, I'm sorry, I can't recall the number. But if you see, we always say one third of the gases is really nitrogen. So out of the total gases only, I think there is something which is also missing here, because it's like,
Yeah.
the three-fourth, and it's only about a quarter, or maybe, one third is kind of oxygen, and the other two-third is nitrogen plus the other gases. So please put these, I'll come back to this with the number as to,
Yes,
because
ma'am.
this
That's
is
what I was saying. Be
exactly.
75%.
You're very right, because you have to look at it according to that number, which we already know, that what is the distribution of nitrogen and oxygen and other gases. So this data should be interpreted in that manner. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
All right. Now let's look at, I'll begin with the carbon cycle. So whenever we discuss about any cycle, there are three things which I'm going to talk about. The first is going to be the natural reservoirs of carbon, where all does carbon occur naturally. Okay, so we will see that it occurs in the atmosphere, in the oceanic bodies, and in the land. And we will see what is the form in which the carbon is available. Number two is carbon fixation, because let's say carbon in the atmosphere is present in the form of carbon dioxide. Now, in many of the reservoirs, as we will see, that the carbon cannot be recycled. It is only carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, which is in the environment, that can be recycled, that can be cycled. The carbon which is present, for example, in the oceanic water bodies, which is trapped as carbonates, for example, calcium carbonate rocks and other things, that's a large reservoir of carbon, but then it cannot be assimilated by the life forms. It is not available for recycling purpose, for cycling purpose. That's what we mean here. Okay, so now very briefly, for example, you have in the atmosphere, you have the source of carbon as carbon dioxide, and then in the lithosphere, in the ground, you have carbon which is stored as limestone or as coal, oil, or gas. In the oceanic water body, for example, there are marine deposits, aquatic biomass, that is where the carbon is also going to be available. Okay, that's what we call as the carbon reservoir. And then how does this really carbon, which is now in the different parts, in the different reservoirs, how does it get cycled? How does it really enter into some kind of a cycle? That is through carbon fixation, because the life forms can take up this carbon dioxide, fix it as organic carbon. So we will look at carbon fixation and energy flow. And in the third part of the carbon cycle is eventually returning this carbon through respiration into atmosphere. Okay, so now you have, of course, fixed carbon dioxide into the organic matter, into the plants. And the plants are going to be, you will have grazers, you will have primary producers, which will take up this food, or you have the secondary consumers, which will take up. But then through biological respiration, that organic matter is going to be broken down into carbon dioxide and water. So eventually the cycle is complete. Okay, so this carbon respiration, therefore, means a lot of organic carbon. Where do you all find this organic carbon? It could be either in the form of organic polymers, which are stored in plants, such as carbohydrates are present in plants, lignin is present in plants, or hemicellulose, etc., or the carbon is also trapped in the form of humus, or the carbon is also, when it is returned back into the environment, it is also returned through methane oxidation. Now, I will talk a little bit about methanogenesis, because the first thing is that how does carbon dioxide get converted into methane from the atmosphere? And then through methane oxidation, carbon returns back in the form of carbon dioxide. Similarly, carbon is also available in the form of carbon monoxide through fossil fuel burning or other C1 compounds. All this carbon gets converted again into CO2, and that enters into the atmosphere. Okay, so in other words, the cycles, they need to be understood in terms of the reservoirs, in terms of how they are cycled from the reservoirs, how are they fixed, and eventually how are they returned back into what can be easily assimilated by life forms. So these three aspects are important in any kind of a elemental cycle. So here is a
Then
slide.
what was the meaning of humus?
Humus I will come to. Normally you see, when you take some soil in your hand, there is a dark brown matter which covers the surface of the soil.
Yes, ma'am.
That is what humus is. But then in terms of its chemistry, in terms of its complexity, it's a lot of organic matter, like the leaf when it decomposes, when the dead organic matter such as worms, insects, etc., they all break down in the soil, and then many of these organic matter, they recombine. Okay, so the dead organic matter, the dead plant matter, and many of these other amino acids, proteins, organic acids, they combine in a very special kind of a chemistry, which happens by enzymes which are present in the soil in order to create a very complex polymer that is called as humus, which is dark brown in color. Of course, it is contained in the soil. So, whenever you take a soil sample, only then humus is present in there. But it's a very complex polymer. I'll show you the structure of it. So that's what humus is. And it's extremely important for the soil because it is very rich in nutrients, etc. And any soil which is devoid of humus is not a fertile soil. Nothing can be cultivated in that soil unless there is humus in it. So again, the humus, the carbon which is in the humus needs to be returned back into the environment. It cannot be trapped in there forever.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, so we will come to that point when we look at how humus is oxidized, how is it formed to begin with, and then how does the carbon which is trapped in the humus, how does it return back into carbon dioxide? So in this picture on the left, in this table, the first thing that you will see are the carbon reservoirs. So there are essentially, the carbon is present in the atmosphere or in the ocean, or it is present on land. Okay, in the atmosphere, the carbon is available in the form of carbon dioxide. And how many metric tons of carbon is written here? And is it actively cycled? The answer is yes. Okay, then in the ocean, the carbon is present, it's trapped in the form of biomass. So all the animals and the plant material or whatever you have, that is the biomass. And about 4 times 10 to the 9 metric tons of carbon is trapped there. Is it actively recycled? The answer is no. Okay, because even the dead organic matter underwater can stay there for a very long time before it gets converted into something like a fossil fuel, which is the dead animal matter, etc. Then it takes years and years for that to form. So it is not something which is easily available. However, in the ocean, it's also present as carbonates, which is one of the largest sources of carbon. Is it actively cycled? The answer is no. So even these carbonates which are in the ocean, in the form of calcium carbonate, or you have rocks which contain carbonates, they are also not available for cycling purpose. Then there is dissolved and particulate organics, dissolved organic matter, because of decomposers which are actively breaking down the matter. So this is one of the small reservoirs, but then it's also, this is what is recycled. On land, for example, the land mass, the humus, and of course the fossil fuel which is present, all of these are also reservoirs of carbon. All of these are actively recycled. But then on land, there are also the carbonate rocks, very much like they are present in the oceanic water bodies, huge reservoir of carbon, but the largest reservoir. But no, it is not actively recycled. Okay, so this is something which I just want you to appreciate, that just because it's a very large reservoir, like 10 to the 17 metric tons, doesn't mean that it is going to be available. This carbon is not available at all, or this is also a large reservoir which is not available. So sometimes it is the smaller reservoirs of carbon which are actively cycled. So it is one of the smallest reservoirs, and it is also subject to perturbation the most, because because of fossil fuel burning, the amount of carbon dioxide which you are going to be adding is going to be much more. So it is also subject to disturbance. So just to give you an appreciation of where all carbon is present, and on this side, for example, is annual flux, metric tons of carbon, which is now cycled, released by fossil fuel consumption, 7 times 10 to the 9 carbon dioxide is released. When you harvest the products of the forests in terms of produce, in terms of wood, etc., again you are going to remove that carbon. So that carbon is being taken away. The flux is about 6 times 10 to the 9 metric tons of carbon per year is taken from here. Okay. So now what is important here is that the ones which are shown in the red, they are the ones which add to carbon dioxide accumulation. Okay, so forest regrowth, uptake by the ocean, etc., it doesn't contribute to accumulation of carbon dioxide. What contributes to accumulation of CO2 in the environment is the fossil fuel burning, as well as the harvests which are taken and decay of organic matter. Okay, now as it is, when you look at carbon dioxide which is released in the environment, okay, there is a buffering role which is played by carbonates in the ocean. That is, the carbon dioxide which is released in the oceanic water body due to respiration and other biological activity, it combines with water to give you bicarbonate, and these bicarbonates can become as a reservoir. Similarly, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can combine with water in the form of carbonic acid, and then all of it gets accumulated as carbonates. So anyway, carbonates, they act as buffers for excess of carbon dioxide. Okay, but whatever may be the case, the atmosphere cannot hold so much of carbon dioxide. This buffering is also only up to a certain level. And that's the reason why this carbon dioxide is left behind in the atmosphere, and it contributes to global warming. Okay, so don't think there is no buffering anyway that is occurring. There is a buffering of carbon dioxide which is occurring. That is, it combines with water to give rise to, you have the carbonic acid or you have the bicarbonates, which can become a part of the carbonate rocks. Okay, so there is a lot of buffering which is already, apart from that, there is excess of carbon dioxide, which leads to global warming. Now, in this second slide is shown carbon fixation. Okay, so that was the first part, was the reservoir. The second is now what is the next part of the carbon? Where does it end up? Through carbon dioxide fixation by either plants or by microorganisms. In the presence of sunlight, the carbon dioxide is fixed in the primary producers. And what are these? These are going to be either plants, or they are photosynthetic bacterium where the biomass gets accumulated, or these are the algal biomass where all that carbon dioxide, enters and it gets trapped into the biomass. Okay, so is this point clear to everybody as to, when you say carbon fixation, what do you mean by that? It enters into the second leg, which is that carbon dioxide now enters into the biomass, which is the second part of the cycle. So is this point clear to everybody?
Ma'am, there is only one way for the entering of the carbon into the organic cycle.
That is true. Absolutely. There is only one way, and that is fixing of atmospheric carbon dioxide. In biological life forms, there is no other way that carbon can be fixed into, because all the food that you eat, whether you are a non-veg or whether you are a vegetarian, you are taking plant products, you are taking fruits, for vegetarians, for example. So you are taking the primary products of photosynthesis. That is how carbon you are consuming. For the non-vegetarians, if they take meat and other things, but again, the goats or whatever you are taking, the fish, they have actually fed on the primary producers. So the
Okay, ma'am.
do you understand? Whether you are a vegetarian, whether you are a non-vegetarian, what you are coming in, the organic matter is only something which is made by the primary producers. There's nothing else. You are not taking gaseous carbon dioxide, you are taking food. And food means this, primary production. And
Ma'am,
what is shown?
isn't there is any way for direct fixation of the carbon from the atmosphere? Like there is only one way for the carbon fixation through microorganisms and plant means.
Absolutely. There is nothing. Of course, today people are trying to develop technologies based on, for example, the incoming carbon dioxide is taken by plants, and ribulose 1,5-diphosphate is the first enzyme, which is a C5 enzyme, which accepts the incoming carbon dioxide and converts that C5 into a C6 molecule. And that C6 is broken down immediately into two C3 molecules, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone. So those two C3 compounds will combine, which is a reverse of glycolytic pathway. Then they will generate glucose. And only
Okay, ma'am.
plants, and only plants, and only the photosynthetic bacteria, the photosynthetic algae, they contain that ribulose 1,5-diphosphate, which is actually part of the C3 pathway. There is also a C4 pathway in many of the bacteria where a C3 compound is the primary acceptor. So that C3 compound accepts incoming carbon dioxide, converts it into C4 compound. These are the only two ways by which carbon dioxide in the environment can be accumulated in the biological systems. And these are called as either the reverse TCA cycle, which is the C3, or the C4 pathways. There is no other way carbon dioxide can be fixed. So today, based on our knowledge of this biochemistry, people can develop these enzymes. What if I develop a super enzyme like ribulose 1,5-diphosphate? Can I make it combine, because this is an enzyme, it needs a C3 substrate, a C5, and it needs carbon dioxide. Can I do those experiments in vitro so that I can fix atmospheric carbon dioxide? Then can I reverse all the cycles in order to make glucose in the laboratory? But so far we can't do that so far. It's only the plants, it's only the photosynthetic bacteria, and it is only the algae which are capable of doing that.
So, ma'am, why don't we just increase this process of carbon fixation through plants and microorganisms? Like,
Uh,
is there any way around it?
you see, there is just no way. And let me come to the second part, what I call is the energy flow here. All right. Now, out of the total solar energy which is incident on the Earth's surface, less than 0.1% is assimilated by the life forms. Of course, you have solar panels today, you are trying to have, but they are very dilute forms of energy. That the solar energy which falls on the Earth's surface, the biological systems can trap less than 0.1% of that. You can calculate it, in terms of the quanta of light energy which falls on the surface, and how much a quantum of light, how much energy it has, and you can compute how much of energy we are able to assimilate. Very, very small part is assimilated. Okay, let me make an important point here. In spite of the process being so inefficient, that is the plants, the bacteria, the photosynthetic bacteria, they are able to capture less than 0.1%. However, this much light is able to support most of the ecosystems on Earth. Okay, today what we are trying to do is to develop crops, because we can't do them outside of a biological system. So we are trying to engineer crops so that now the crops can be more efficient, or the same enzymes in them are capable of trapping more carbon dioxide which is coming in there. So that's a different line of research altogether. So you are developing energy efficient crops so that more carbon dioxide, the yield of the carbohydrates which you are capturing could be more. So
What is the 100%, 15%, 2%,
I'll
and
tell
3%?
you. I'll
They
tell
are
you.
the energy.
Yes, yes, because at every trophic level, so if this 0.1% in the primary producers can be considered as 100% energy, okay, then when you go to the grazers, which are actually the primary consumers, this is a point which I discussed earlier with you under the ecosystem. Only 10% of the energy passes. The rest, nearly 90%, is lost through respiration. Do you remember those ecological pyramids which we talked about? The primary consumer, the secondary, the tertiary consumer. So at every trophic level, you see that out of 100%, just about maximum 15% moves to the grazer. Then again, just about 10%, 10% would have been 1.5. You are a little bit better off here. So only 2% moves to the secondary consumer. Then which is again 10%, just about 10% of this. That's what these numbers refer to. That is in terms of energy flow. If the total radiation which is incident on the earth, if that is considered as being 100%, okay, then at every trophic level, there is loss of 90% of that energy through respiration, and only 10% moves into the next trophic level. That's what the numbers mean. Okay, so is this point clear to everybody?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
All right. So now on the right, and people have measured the productivities. I have already talked to you about the coral reef, which is an ecosystem, or a sugarcane field, a tropical rainforest, ocean, etc., a rice paddy field. This is an ecosystem by itself. Why? Because there is cycling of nutrients all the time. So there is a systematic flow of carbon as well as energy. All right, then only it qualifies as an ecosystem. So among the different ecosystems, you see, coral reef, by the way, is one of the most efficient systems. Why? The net primary productivity, which is measured in terms of gram dry organic matter per square meter per year, which is assembled, is largest in the coral reef. And that's why all over the world, people are beginning to understand that why coral reefs are so important. Because the photosynthetic microbes which are a part of the coral reef, they are able to trap a lot of carbon dioxide into organic matter every year. Then there is also cornfield. Then there is the sugarcane field. So you see, up to 9400 or up to 6000. Now you may say, why don't you call them very high? But you see, in these two, significant amount of energy is put into these systems in terms of fertilizers. You are adding a lot of nitrogen, you are adding a lot of phosphorus into the system. So even if productivity is very high, but then you have to put in a lot into it to get that number. Okay, and incidentally, corn and sugarcane, you will recognize, what kind of leaves do they have. The leaves that they have are very different. These are monocot plants. If you compare them to the leaves of, for example, you must have seen at least mutter somewhere. These are all dicots. The seeds, you will recall, they are, when you open, for example, a pigeon pea, there are two cotyledons. So these are dicots. But things like corn, things like sugarcane, these are monocotyledons. Okay, they are grasses actually. Okay, all these grasses are C4 plants. And by C4, what we mean is that the primary acceptor of incoming carbon dioxide is a C3 compound, which I told you. So that C3 compound, it's like glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. It combines with carbon dioxide to make a C4 compound. And in C4 plants, the photosynthesis is far more efficient. Whereas if you look at, for example, other plants, like you have peas and you have other things, these are C3 plants because the primary acceptor of incoming carbon dioxide is a C5 compound. So C5 plus carbon dioxide makes a C6, which is highly unstable. It breaks down quickly into 2C3, and that's why they are called as C3 plants. Okay, so
What
please.
does that number, the C3, C5 indicates? I'm unable to recall. Can you please tell me?
I will just quickly repeat for you. Now, when you say a C3 plant, okay, that means the first stable product of carbon dioxide assimilation is going to be an organic carbon compound which has 3 carbons, like glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, dihydroxyacetone 3-phosphate. They are part of glycolytic pathway. Okay, so both of these are organic compounds which contain only 3 carbons. Is that clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And when I say SC4, that means that those plants in which the first stable product of photosynthesis is an organic compound in which the number of carbon atoms is 4, that is called as a C4 plant. So the acceptor must have been a C3. That is why the stable product is a C4, isn't it? So those are called as the C4 plants. So the corn plants, the sugarcane plants are all C4. Rice is also a C4 plant. Your wheat, for example, that is also a C4. All grasses which you see, okay, all grasses are C4 plants. And others which are non-grass, they are all C3 plants. So I hope that distinction is very clear to everybody. So should we move ahead now or take a 5-minute break? Hello?
A break would be better.
Okay, so we will just pause for 5 minutes and then come back in 5 minutes and then we will resume.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so let's resume and go to the next slide now. So here is the third part, which is now, I hope everybody is back here.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So now we are looking at the last leg of the carbon cycle, which we called as respiration, because all this fixed carbon, which you saw in the second part, is needs to be returned back in the form of carbon dioxide into the environment. And this process is called as respiration. So we say that it is a process whereby the stored carbon is returned back. Now, it has been estimated that if respiration does not occur, then the question has been asked as when will carbon dioxide become limiting on Earth if this process were not to occur? So it is estimated that in about 30 to 300 years, then no more carbon dioxide, the carbon cycling is expected to stop completely if this biological respiration does not occur. So it's extremely important part of the overall cycle. In other words, because the earth cannot continue or the carbon cycles cannot continue unless the respiration is there. All right. Now this respiration, for example, I have shown here two blue boxes. So the respiration can be either aerobic in nature, that is in the presence of molecular oxygen, or it can be anaerobic. Okay, so respiration doesn't always mean that any organic matter has to be completely mineralized into carbon dioxide and water. That only happens in the presence of aerobic setup. Okay, however, apart from this, there is anaerobic respiration, which is also constantly going on Earth, which is in the absence of oxygen. Okay, as a result of which CH2 is nothing but a carbohydrate which can be converted. So through partial degradation in the absence of molecular oxygen, it can be converted into like volatile fatty acids, which are listed here, or for example alcohols, like you can have butanol, you can have ethanol, etc., which are only products of anaerobic fermentation. Okay, and remember that many of these acids, which are like fatty acids, etc., they can be assimilated eventually into fossil fuels. So this is also an important part of the overall cycle, because you are saying that fossil fuels need to be renewed. This is a source of carbon which everybody wants to be there. Okay, these are the reservoirs where carbon is stored, and this partial oxidation of a carbohydrate into a fatty acids and accumulation of all of these fatty acids, etc., finally leads to formation of fossil fuels. Okay, at the same time, now carbon dioxide is also a byproduct of anaerobic fermentation, and CO2 is released at many steps. If you start out with a glucose, let's say C6, and eventually you make an alcohol like C2H5OH, so you have only accounted for 3 carbons, but the other carbon is now also released as carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide can get trapped as methane, which is one of the reservoirs of carbon. So that is methanogenesis process. Okay, so even in the anaerobic process, for example, there is an attempt for carbon to be going back to the reservoirs like fossil fuels and methane, apart from carbon being returned to the environment as carbon dioxide. So both of these activities are extremely important. So I hope you are able to see that point. What is so all this carbohydrate which you have fixed up through photosynthesis doesn't really go only in the form of carbon dioxide into the environment, but through this activity it can also be going back into the fossil fuel. It can be going into the methane sources. So when you talk about respiration, okay, in respiration, we are going to roughly look at respiration, that is returning of carbon dioxide into the environment through breakdown of organic polymers, or through breakdown of humus, or through breakdown of C1 compounds. Okay. Because, why do we talk about this? Because these are the 3 major polymers in which the atmospheric carbon dioxide has been fixed up in the life forms. Okay, so if you look at the plant matter, or if you look at even algae, etc., they are going to store these organic polymers in the form of either cellulose or hemicellulose or lignin, or fungi, for example, they also feed and they store this carbon dioxide in the form of their cell walls, which are chitin containing molecules. And fungi, eventually they do feed on organic matter like sugars and other things, but a part of the carbon they also trap in their cell wall. So if that carbon is to be released into the environment, you should know how chitin is broken down, or how peptidoglycan, which is present in the bacterial cell wall as a polymer, is broken down to carbon dioxide. Okay, so the question is that what you need to see through all of this is that the organic polymers which are trapped by biological forms through CO2 fixation, be it cellulose, be it chitin, be it peptidoglycan, or be it arthropod, that is, these are the insect exoskeletons. Okay, in any form of these polymers, eventually they have to be broken down. There have to be biochemistries, biochemical pathways, which are going to break them down and return this carbon, trapped carbon, into environment as carbon dioxide. Okay, so I will explain this point in a while. Then there is humus also, which is an organic polymer, and through respiration, again, the carbon which is trapped in the humus needs to be returned back. And humus is, there are reactive monomers which are resulting from the breakdown of lignin during degradation of organic matter. And these reactive monomers, they can spontaneously polymerize. They are very rich and they support diverse microbial community. And humus is an integral part of the soil. It's a polymer which is present in the soil. All right. In addition to that, respiration also has to occur of compounds like methane, for example, which can be formed, or there are a lot of other C1 compounds which are present in nature, which only through microbial activities, the carbon in these C1 compounds, okay, by C1 what we mean? Methanol, methylamine, trimethylamine, or carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, they are all C1 compounds. And eventually, many of these other C1 compounds, other than carbon dioxide, has to be converted into CO2 in order to complete the carbon cycle. Okay, so I hope, I hope all of these points are clear to everybody as to why, because all organic matter which is stored on Earth through CO2 fixation is either an organic polymer, or it is humus, or it is some or the other C1 compound, which again needs to be broken down through respiration and CO2 returned into the environment. Now, these organic polymers which you see here are predominantly of two types. Either they can be carbohydrates, or these are phenylpropene based polymers. For example, if you look at cellulose, cellulose is only a glucose polymer. Okay, you put glucose but in a beta-1,4 linkage, and you put thousands of these together in a beta-1,4 linkage and you come up with cellulose. So it is basically a carbohydrate polymer. Similarly, the hemicellulose, for example, is something between SC5 sugar like arabinose or xylose or glucose. So again, it is a carbohydrate polymer. Lignin, on the other hand, is an aromatic polymer. Okay, and it is phenylpropene based. Chitin is again an acetyl glucosamine. So it is a sugar-based polymer. It's a carbohydrate polymer. Peptidoglycans, you will recall, is again an acetyl glucosamine is the sugar, and these sugars are linked together by these peptide linkages. So basically, these are also carbohydrate polymer. Okay, so is this clear? Is this clear to everybody? That why do we say that all the biological polymers which are fixed are either carbohydrate polymers or they are phenylpropene based? So it's an aromatic, aromatic backbone. So it is important to understand the microbial activities which are capable of breaking down these polymers, and this can form a basis for using microbes for removal of organic contaminants from the soil. So I hope this logic and this rationale you are able to understand. Okay, now in this, I'm not going to talk about cellulose, hemicellulose breakdown at all, because, even starch, for example, is a plant polymer. For starch, amylases are already there. Amylase can break down sucrose into glucose. Hemicellulose also can be broken down very easily, but I'm going to focus on lignin because many of you may not know about it. Now, lignin is present in plants and it's a very complex aromatic polymer. This is what the structure of this polymer looks like. Okay, so is this familiar to you? I mean, people, your high school, biology, you will remember that all plant cell walls are made up of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. So can you recall that? So students, are you still there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Right.
ma'am.
Please pay attention. I'm hopeful that people are paying attention to what's going on in the class. So, so these lignin, which are a part of the plant polymers, are extremely complex aromatic molecules, like you see. Okay, and all of these are basically derived from phenylpropene. That's the structure of phenylpropene. Okay, that's the reason why in this last slide I said all of these polymers are either called as the carbohydrate polymer or phenylpropene. Why? Because lignin is actually derived, the monomer of lignin is a phenylpropene. Just like, if you have a carbohydrate polymer like starch, starch is built up from putting glucose units together. Okay, so this phenylpropene is modified, it is functionalized, and there are three building blocks of lignin. And these are, like, for example, the one which is shown in the blue here, or the one which is shown in the pink, or the one which is shown in the red. And then there are some modifications here and there, but these are essentially the three major polymers, what we call them as three building blocks of lignin. Okay, one such is shown here. Okay, and the way microbes act on it is by producing, like fungi will produce a lignin peroxidase, and it breaks it down into this moiety. Or for example, you can have something like this happening: a formaldehyde group is going to leave, and then you have this, and then microbial activities like dioxygenases will act on them in order to convert this into vanillin. And vanillin gets converted into vanillic acid, into this protocatechoic acid. You just have to remember the briefs of it. Okay, and through microbial activity, a lot of microbes, they have enzymes which can convert this into succinic acid, and from there it enters into TCA cycle. So eventually, even these phenylpropene units, what you are starting out here, gets mineralized through TCA cycle into carbon dioxide and water. And this is how carbon cycle is completed. Okay, so you fixed up the atmospheric carbon dioxide as a polymer, either a carbohydrate based polymer or a phenylpropene based polymer. Then through microbial activities, these are broken down, assimilated into the major pathways like TCA cycle, the glycolytic pathway, and then completely oxidized into carbon dioxide and water. Okay, now another thing to be noted here is that these phenylpropene units which you see here, which are the building blocks of lignin, are very similar to organic pollutants such as benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, which are present in the crude oil, in the gasoline, and in the creosote, which is found in the food preservatives. Therefore, microbial pathways that degrade lignin can allow harnessing of enzymes that can be used in the bioremediation of these BTEX compounds. Okay, so is that rationale clear to everybody? Why so much curiosity in knowing how lignin is broken down? Well, because many of the organic pollutants which you have are very similar to structure, similar in structure to phenylpropene. So we can use these microbes which produce these enzymes as a part of a microbial consortium to remove these organic pollutants, aromatic pollutants. So is that point clear to everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. All right. So very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on humus because very complex. But what is shown to you here on the right is the humus polymer. Okay, so the first thing which you will see striking is that it is an aromatic polymer. Large number of these aromatic rings are fused together in order to make humus. Okay, and what do we have here? For example, the larger atoms here, for example, are the carbon. The smaller ones are nitrogen. For example, there are not too many nitrogen, but this one over here, if you expand, you'll be able to see the difference. And this is slightly pink in color where my arrow is pointing. Or this one here is a nitrogen, which is pink in color, slightly smaller. Okay, and what you see here as the bigger of gray, these are the oxygen atoms and the small ones are the hydrogen atoms. Okay, so basically humus, you see, is a very complex polymer and essentially build up from carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. In addition to that, the R groups here are the various functional groups. It can be a methyl group, it can be a carboxylic group, it can be a sulfonated group, any other acidic group, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's what I would like you to be able to understand. And how does humus formation occur in the soil? So very briefly on the left, for example, is explained that I think what you need to only appreciate, I don't expect you to remember this figure, but just to appreciate that both organic residues which are in the soil, like carbohydrates, like other things which are in the soil, plus lignin and other plant polyphenolic compounds, they undergo microbial degradation in the soil, and organic units are made. Breakdown of organic residues like protein will result in the formation of amino acids. But if you have, for example, if polymers are there, carbohydrates, they will be broken down into sugars, organic acids, etc. And through a combination of all of these, within the soil, various enzymatic processes, auto-oxidation processes, or modifications are going to occur. A lot of these chemical reactions occur in the soil in order to make the humic material. Okay, and the humic material, very slowly, it can break down into individual components and carbon dioxide. All right, but nevertheless, it's extremely important for the soil health for these compounds to be there. Okay, and it's very briefly to allow you to understand that how this humic material, because lignin is also, as I showed you in the last slide, it is a polymer, organic polymer, but in terms of their properties, they are very different. The humic material is black in color. Methoxyl content is very different, nitrogen content is very different in the two, and since it has high nitrogen content, that's why it's very good as a nutrient source also. So if you want to grow plants and other things in there, the soil must contain humus because it contains nitrogen. Then carboxyl, phenolic, hydroxyl capacity, total exchangeable acidity, so protons highly movable, nitrogen, alpha amino nitrogen is present, vanillin content is less than 1%, here it is 15 to 20. So there's a lot of difference between lignin and the humus material. And in this slide, again, you remember we had the third compound, which were called as the C1 compounds, because a lot of carbon is trapped in these C1 compounds, and, it needs to go back into the atmosphere. What is the list of these C1 compounds? They are all listed here. The carbon is present in the form of either carbon dioxide, which is through respiration people are generating. So it is already returned, but it can be also present as carbon monoxide, because when you burn the fossil fuel or because of the natural activities in the atmosphere, because of volcanic activities, because of UV irradiation, a lot of carbon monoxide is formed. Okay, methane is formed, methanol is there, formaldehyde, formate, formamide, dimethyl, all of these compounds you will see they are all C1 compounds. Okay, and through microbial activities they can be converted into carbon dioxide and eventually the carbon cycle can be completed. Okay, so what I'm very quickly going to go over is only, now first of all, before we look at the breakdown of methane, let us see how methane is formed in the environment. Okay, so methane is formed due to methanogenic bacteria which combine hydrogen, carbon dioxide in nature to give rise to methane. Okay, apart from this, methane can also be formed from acetate, formate, and methanol combustion. And these organisms are called as methanogens. They depend on other microbes to generate these compounds. So community development is very important for methane formation. Okay, so we are going to look at, for example, now how C1 compound can be broken down. Okay, now under this category, there are two groups which I'm going to discuss about, which are called as either methanotrophs or methylotrophs. Methanotrophs are those organisms which are able to break down only methane, no other C1 compound. Okay, so I hope that that distinction will be clear in your mind. Methanotrophs are the groups of microorganisms which break down only methane, and these are chemoheterotrophic and they are aerobic obligately. That is, you don't have anaerobic bacteria which can make methane. Okay, simply because in order to have methane oxidized, okay, oxygen is required. And how does methane get converted into carbon dioxide? You can have methane first converted, you have a single oxygen added here to make methanol, formaldehyde, formic acid, carbon dioxide, and water. So that is how methane is metabolized. Okay. So we are discussing this leg of the respiration, C1 compound. So it's clear to everybody? Very quickly, yes or no?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
sir.
yes.
Okay, so there are some enzymes, please read them through. So these methanogens, for example, are extremely important. So please read it, what is written here. And the second are groups of microorganisms which break down the C1 compound other than methane. Okay, by other than methane, what do we mean? That they could be using carbon monoxide, they could be using methanol, they could be using formaldehyde, etc. So all those will be will be called as methylotrophs. And I'm going to discuss only the case study I will do will be for carbon monoxide oxidation. Okay, so carbon monoxide is also produced in the Earth's environment to the tune of 3 times 10 to the 9 metric tons per year. And there are abiotic as well as biotic sources for carbon monoxide. For example, there can be photochemical oxidation of methane, which occurs, this is through non-biological activity, or burning of woods as it occurs spontaneously. So carbon monoxide is produced. Through biological activity, so many metric tons of carbon monoxide are produced. Okay, now when it comes to converting carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide, okay, there are two routes. One, which is called as abiotic route, that is in which life forms are not involved, such as oxidation in the atmosphere to CO2, because carbon monoxide can combine with molecular oxygen to give rise to carbon dioxide, and this completes the cycle of carbon. Okay, or there can be biotic routes, that is in which life forms are involved, which can be either aerobic or which can be anaerobic. Under aerobic routes, carbon monoxide will combine with water and carbon dioxide is made, hydrogen is released. Under anaerobic processes, carbon monoxide is reduced to methane. Okay, so that's it. So I'm going to just stop here today, and we are already at 10:54. So this is where I'm going to stop, and the next time we will finish the nitrogen and the sulfur cycle. So is this clear to everybody as to whatever we have discussed so far?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so the lecture recording is already there, and the reading material also I'm going to share with you. So and then we come back and we meet next Monday.